She survived him once. She built something small and fragile from the wreckage he left behind. A job, a son, a life that fit inside 2 rooms and smelled like coffee grounds and dish soap. For 10 years, Malene Hartwell told herself the worst was over. She was wrong. Because on a Tuesday afternoon in November, with rain cracking against the windows and the espresso machine hissing steam into the cold air, the bell above the door rang, and the man who destroyed her walked back in. The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst things always do. It came off Lake Michigan sometime afternoon, pushing a wall of freezing rain ahead of it that turned the downtown sidewalks into dark mirrors and drove the lunch crowd back inside their office towers. By 2 o'clock, the streets were nearly empty. By 2:30, the gutters were running fast and brown with water. The few people still outside moved with their heads down and their shoulders hunched, not looking at anything except the ground directly in front of their feet. Malene Hartwell was used to this. She was used to the storms, used to the dead hours between the lunch rush and the evening commute. She was used to the particular silence that settled over the cafe when the last customer pushed out the door and left her alone with the machines and the rain and her own thoughts. She had been working the day shift at Crossroads Coffee for 3 years. Before that, a diner on the South Side. Before that, a hotel breakfast counter in Evanston, where the manager kept cutting her hours until there was nothing left to cut. She had learned not to complain. Complaining was a luxury for people who had other options. She was wiping down the espresso machine when Marcus, the owner, came out of the back office with his coat already on. "The storm is getting bad," he said. "I am going to run to the supply place before they close early. Are you good here?" "I am good," she said. "Ethan gets out at 3:15. I know when Ethan gets out." Marcus gave her a look, the particular look of a man who wanted to say something, but had learned over time that saying it would not help, and then he pulled his collar up and went out into the rain. The bell above the door rang twice, once when he opened it, and once when it swung shut behind him. Malene went back to wiping down the machine. The cafe was the kind of place that existed in the gaps between other more important places. It had 12 tables, a counter with 6 stools, and a window that looked out onto the intersection of Wacker and Monroe. The foot traffic was heavy enough during business hours to keep them profitable, and thin enough at 2 in the afternoon to make the room feel abandoned. The walls were exposed brick. The lighting was warm and low. Someone who did not know better might call it cozy. Malene called it work. She was 31 years old and she looked it, but not in the way the magazines meant when they said that. She looked the way a person looks who has been tired for a long time and has stopped trying to hide the tiredness. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there at 23. Her hands were rougher than they used to be. She kept her dark hair pulled back because loose hair was impractical, and practicality was the governing principle of her life. She owned 4 pairs of shoes. 2 of them were work shoes. She bought Ethan's clothes at the end of season sales and kept a spreadsheet on her phone of every dollar she spent and where it went. She did not think about the past if she could help it. She was very good at not thinking about the past. The machine hissed, she wiped. The rain hit the window in irregular patterns, loud and then soft, loud and then soft. At 2:47, the black SUVs appeared. She noticed them because that was the kind of neighborhood where you noticed black SUVs. They came around the corner off Wacker in a loose convoy. 3 of them, maybe 4, moving slowly through the rain with their headlights on, even though it was not dark yet. They moved the way expensive cars move when the people inside them are not in a hurry, because they do not have to be in a hurry. They moved like a statement. Malene watched them through the window without really thinking about them. They were probably headed to one of the hotels or the private parking structure on Monroe. She watched them the way you watch anything that passes by a window when the room is quiet, without meaning to, without it meaning anything. Then the lead SUV slowed down. Then it stopped. She went back to the machine. There were glasses to polish. The afternoon delivery had come in short on oat milk, and she needed to call the distributor before they closed. Ethan had a science project due Thursday, and she had not bought the display board yet. These were the things that occupied Malene Hartwell's mind on a Tuesday in November. Small, concrete, solvable things. The bell above the door rang. She did not look up immediately. She heard the door open. She heard the particular way the outdoor sounds changed when someone came in out of the rain. The brief rush of cold air, the wet sound of the storm, then the muffled quiet of the cafe reasserting itself. She heard footsteps, more than one person. She finished polishing the glass she was working on and set it on the shelf. And then she turned around. Two men she did not recognize stood just inside the door. They were large and very still, wearing dark suits that were expensive enough to look like uniforms. And they were not looking at her. They were looking at the room, scanning it the way you scan a space when your job is to decide whether the space is safe. One of them moved to the left. The other stayed by the door. Neither of them said anything. Malene had worked in service long enough to read a room in under 3 seconds. She read this one and felt the first cold thing move through her stomach. Then the door opened again, and Nikolai Voss walked in. She knew him before she had fully processed what she was seeing. That was the thing about 10 years. It was supposed to be enough time to turn a person into a stranger. 10 years was long enough to make someone's face unfamiliar. Long enough to soften the specific memories into something general and manageable. Long enough to take the sharpness out of a voice and the particular weight out of a presence. That was what she had told herself. That was what she had built her entire interior life around believing. She was wrong about that too. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe the memory had compressed him over time. His hair was darker than it used to be and shorter on the sides, cut close. The jaw was harder. The lines of his face were the same lines, just more defined, more settled into themselves. He was wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than 3 months of her rent, and he walked like a man who had not had to apologize for taking up space in a very long time. 33 years old. Nikolai Voss was 33 years old, and he had spent the last decade becoming something that people in Chicago talked about in careful voices and careful words, when they talked about him at all. He came through the door and he looked up and their eyes met. The glass she had been reaching for, she did not even know she had reached for it, slipped off the edge of the shelf and hit the floor. It did not shatter. It bounced once on the rubber mat behind the counter and rolled against the cabinet with a hollow sound that seemed very loud in the silence. Malene did not move to pick it up. Nikolai did not move at all. For a moment that was probably 4 seconds long and felt like something geological. Neither of them did anything. The two men in suits stood perfectly still. The rain hit the window. The espresso machine clicked through its idle cycle. Then one of the suited men took a small step toward the counter and said they would like a table. Malene pulled her eyes away from Nikolai. She looked at the man who had spoken. She looked at the room full of empty tables, 12 of them all available. She nodded and said in a voice that did not betray her, "Sit anywhere you like." She crouched down and picked up the glass. Her hands were steady. She had survived worse than this. That was what she told herself while she was crouched behind the counter with her back to the room. She had survived worse than this, and she would not fall apart in her own workplace over a man who had chosen his empire over her when she was 21 years old. A man she had loved the way you love things before the world teaches you what love actually costs. She stood back up. Nikolai had taken the corner table. The table by the window that looked out onto the rain-slicked intersection. The one that faced the door, where you could see everything in the room without being directly in the center of it. He sat with his back against the wall. His two men had positioned themselves at tables on either side. They were close enough to move fast, far enough to give the appearance of privacy. Malene tied her apron tighter without thinking about it. She took a breath. She picked up her order pad and she walked to the corner table. Nikolai watched her approach. He did not pretend not to. He watched her the way she imagined. He watched everything, with a kind of absolute attention that was uncomfortable to be the subject of. An attention that felt less like admiration and more like calculation, like he was measuring something. The distance between who she had been and who she was now. She thought that. She made herself stop thinking it. "What can I get you?" she said. Not a question. Not quite. She heard that in her own voice, and she could not decide whether it was strength or just defensive flatness, the emotional equivalent of scar tissue. Malene, her name in his mouth. She had not heard that in 10 years. She had not prepared for it despite all her preparation, despite everything she had done to seal the past away. It landed somewhere under her sternum and sat there. "What can I get you?" she said again. She did not look at his face. She looked at the table. Her pen was on the pad. A pause. Then he asked for black coffee. "We have several," she told him. "Whatever is darkest," he replied. She wrote it down as if there was something to write. She turned and walked back to the counter, and she did not look back. Her hands started shaking when she was behind the machine with her back to the room, and she watched them shake for a moment like they belonged to someone else. And then she made the coffee. He stayed for 40 minutes. He did not speak to her again. He sat at the corner table with his hands around the cup and his eyes on the window, or on the room, or possibly on her. She refused to turn around and verify. His men sat and drank nothing. No one else came into the cafe while he was there. She cleaned things that did not need cleaning. She checked her phone twice. 2:58, 3:09. Ethan would be out of school in 6 minutes. The teacher would hold him in the classroom if no one was there. But Ethan hated being the last one. He hated the waiting, hated the particular embarrassment of it. Malene had spent 3 years arranging her entire schedule around never letting that happen. At 3:14, she heard the chair move. She heard footsteps cross the room. She heard the bell above the door ring. She looked up. The 2 suited men had gone. The corner table was empty except for the coffee cup and a folded bill placed beneath it. She walked over, picked up the bill without looking at the denomination, and put it in the register. She took the cup to the sink. She thought, "Good. He came. He saw. He left. That is over." She was wrong about that for the 3rd time in one afternoon. He was back the next day. Same time, same black SUVs in the same configuration, same 2 men, same corner table, same order. "Black coffee, darkest you have." He sat for 38 minutes, and he watched the rain, which had continued through the night and showed no sign of stopping. And he did not speak to her. On the 3rd day, Marcus noticed. "Do you know that guy?" Marcus asked, watching Nikolai's convoy pull away from the window. "No," she replied. Marcus was a careful man, not stupid. He looked at Malene the way he had looked at her on the day she came in about the job 3 years ago. He was measuring what she was telling him against what she was not telling him, the same way you would check a structure for load-bearing walls. He did not say anything else. He went back to the office. On the 4th day, a different man came in 15 minutes before Nikolai arrived. He was older with a gray beard trimmed close and a quality of attentiveness about him that seemed professional. He ordered tea, which they did not have, and then coffee, which he did not drink. He looked at Malene twice. Not the way customers look at servers, but the way someone looks when they are confirming something. At 2:46, he left. At 2:52, Nikolai arrived. On the 5th day, a Friday, Malene arrived at work 40 minutes early. She stood in the back office with the door closed and told herself that she was going to say something. She had been turning the speech over in her mind all week, shaping it and revising it the way you work a piece of metal, hammering at it until it was hard and precise and said exactly what she meant. She was going to walk up to his table and tell him quietly, without drama, that whatever he was doing here needed to stop. She was going to be calm. She was not going to let him see the damage. She had been practicing calm for 10 years. She was very good at it. At 2:55, the bell rang. She came out from behind the counter, walked across the cafe, and stopped at the corner table. Nikolai looked up. "Why are you here?" she said. It was not the speech she had prepared. Just that, 4 words, direct and cold. He did not answer immediately. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her all week, with that measuring, uncomfortable attention. And then he said he needed coffee. "There are approximately 900 places in this city to get coffee," she said. "I know," he replied. She waited. He did not offer anything more than that. The rain was lighter today, more of a mist than a storm, and the gray light through the window made the room feel like something underwater. She was aware of his men at their peripheral tables. She was aware that she was still holding her order pad like a prop. "You need to stop coming here," she said. "Is it a problem?" he asked. Yes, you are busy. I am telling you to stop. Something moved in his expression. She could not name it exactly. Something that was not quite guilt and was not quite pain, but was in the neighborhood of both. Like a man who recognized a damage he was responsible for, but had not yet decided what to do about the recognition. I just want to talk to you, he said. We do not have anything to talk about, she replied. Malene, don't, he said. The word came out harder than she meant it to, with more edge than she intended to show him. She pulled it back, smoothed her voice. Sir, if you are not going to order anything, I need the table. He looked at her for another moment, then he ordered black coffee, whatever was darkest. She walked back to the machine. Her chest was tight in a way that made breathing feel like work. She made the coffee. She brought it to the table, and she set it down without looking at his face, and she walked away. He stayed for 42 minutes. On the following Monday, she called in sick for the first time in 3 years. She spent the day at Ethan's school, sitting in the parking lot through dismissal. She watched him come out with his backpack hanging off one shoulder, and his sneakers untied the way they always were. She watched him cross the blacktop toward the gate. He was 10 years old and small for his age, with a serious face that broke occasionally, and without warning into a wide, slightly gap-toothed smile that could rearrange a room. He had her nose and her stubbornness. His eyes were his father's. Dark, very dark, with that same quality of total attention. She had never let herself think too much about that. You didn't have to pick me up, Ethan said, getting into the car. I know, she replied. Am I in trouble, he asked. No, she said. He looked at her sideways in the careful way he had. Her son was a child who watched and listened more than he spoke, who processed things slowly and thoroughly before arriving at a conclusion. At 10 years old, he was already better at reading her than most adults. Are you okay? He asked. I am fine, she said. You are not fine, he replied. You look like you look before you have to do something hard. She looked at him. She considered him, this small, serious person who was the central fact of her life. I am okay, she said. Just a headache. He put his seatbelt on. He did not believe her, but he let it go. That was one of the things about Ethan. He chose his battles carefully. She drove home through the gray November afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table after he went to bed, and she thought about what she was doing and what she should do, and what 10 years of distance had actually purchased her. She thought about the night everything ended, the hotel room and the rain and the things Nikolai had said and had not said, the cold she had felt in the elevator going down, the way she had stood on the sidewalk afterward with no coat and no plan, and the understanding that the future she had been counting on had just been erased. She thought about the weeks that followed, the discoveries she had not been prepared for, the choices she had made alone. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the cafe, not the entitled way, not the cold way, not the way you would expect from a man who had deliberately walked out of someone's life and built an empire on the other side of the door. He had looked at her the way a man looks when he is genuinely wrecked by something. She had noticed it. She had spent 10 years developing the ability not to let things like that matter to her, and she had noticed it anyway. She went to bed. She did not sleep. On Tuesday, she went back to work. He was not there. He was not there Wednesday either, or Thursday. By Friday, she had almost convinced herself it was over, that he decided she was right, that there was nothing to be said, that the week of silent coffee was closure enough, and he had moved on to whatever a man like that moved on to. Some negotiation or territorial dispute or federal investigation or whatever filled the hours for the head of Chicago's most entrenched criminal organization. On Saturday, she was closing the cafe alone when a knock came at the glass door, not the bell. A knock, direct and deliberate. She looked up. He was alone. No SUVs, no suits, no configuration. Just Nikolai Voss standing on the other side of the glass door in the rain, his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her. She stood there with her cleaning cloth in her hand, and she thought, do not open it. She opened it. We are closed, she said. I know, he replied. How did you know I close on Saturdays, she asked. He did not answer that, which was its own answer. He had someone watching the schedule. Of course he had. She looked at him. She really looked at him for the first time without the counter between them. And she saw things she had not let herself see in the controlled environment of the cafe, the exhaustion under the composure, the way he was standing. Not the way a powerful man stands, not the way he had been standing inside, but with a quality of uncertainty that sat wrong on a frame that had been built for certainty. 5 minutes, she said. And then you leave and you don't come back. She stepped aside. He came in out of the rain. She did not offer him a chair. She stayed by the door. I looked for you, he said after for a long time. I need you to understand. Do not, she said. You do not get to tell me about looking for me. Whatever story you have in your head about what happened and why, it doesn't matter. It was 10 years ago and I have a life. I know, he said. Then why are you here? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. The rain was coming down harder now, the way it had been all week. The drops on the window were large and irregular, hitting the glass and running in long tracks toward the sill. He looked at the room the way he had been looking at it all week. And then he looked at her, and he said, I need you to understand what I did, not to fix it. I am not here to ask you for anything. I just need someone who was there to know the truth. Malene felt something tighten in her chest, felt the walls she had built doing their job, holding steady. The truth, she said, and her voice came out flat and careful. My father ordered your death, he said. He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed many times, quietly and without flourish, as though the quietness could take some of the weight out of the words. The night I left, that wasn't me leaving. That was me keeping you alive. He found out about you. He found out how much I had, what you were to me. And he told me that if I didn't cut you off completely, if I didn't make it permanent, he would have you killed. And I didn't. He stopped. I didn't warn you because warning you would have put a target on you. I didn't explain because explanation would have given you a reason to fight it. And you would have fought it because that is who you are. I left because leaving was the only way I knew how to make you disappear from his sight. He paused again. I thought you'd move on. I thought you'd build a life somewhere that was nothing to do with any of this. The room was very quiet except for the rain. Malene looked at him. She looked at the man who had walked out of a hotel room 10 years ago and told her with his posture and his silence that he had chosen power over her, that she had been weighed and found insufficient, that the empire won. She had built the entire architecture of her recovery on that understanding, on the belief that she had been discarded because being discarded, being rejected was survivable. It had a shape, it had edges. You could learn to live around it. What he was describing now had no edges. What he was describing was a man who had chosen her survival over his own soul and then had to spend a decade pretending that wasn't what he had done. She wanted to throw something. She wanted to sit down on the floor. She did neither. She stood in the middle of her closed cafe with her cleaning cloth in her hand, and she looked at Nikolai Voss and she said, I was pregnant. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. She watched his face. She watched what the words did to it. Not a flinch, not a quick shock of surprise, but something much slower and much worse. Something that moved through him like a tide going out, leaving everything exposed. When I found out, she said, you had been gone for 2 months. I had already left the apartment. I was staying with a friend in Wicker Park. I had $40 in my account and I was 3 months along. And the man who was supposed to. She stopped. She made herself continue. I didn't tell you. I decided not to because whatever you had chosen, I wasn't going to let my child grow up in the middle of it. I was going to give them something clean. Nikolai had not moved. He seemed to have stopped breathing. His name is Ethan, she said. He is 10 years old. He likes baseball and building things, and he is the best person I have ever known in my life. Her voice was holding steady, and she hated that she was proud of this right now. Proud of her own steadiness, when what she felt was the opposite of steady. He has your eyes, she said. Nikolai's jaw moved. The muscles in it worked briefly and then stopped. He looked like a man who had taken a blow in a place he hadn't known could be hit. I have a son, he said. Not a question, not quite a statement. The sentence seemed to be something he was testing, turning over in his mouth to see what it weighed. Yes, she said. 10 years, he murmured. Yes, she repeated. Malene, he started. Don't, she said. The word came out sharp and final. Don't apologize. Don't promise me anything. Don't stand in my cafe and tell me what this means to you, because I have been doing this alone for 10 years, and I don't need your grief right now. I don't have room for it." He stood there and took that. He didn't argue with it or explain it or try to soften it. He stood there and let her words hit him, and he absorbed them with an expression that was the closest thing to genuine devastation she had seen on an adult face in recent memory. The bell above the door didn't ring because the door didn't open. Nothing moved in the room. The rain came down outside. Then Nikolai said in a voice that was very quiet and completely stripped of its usual control, "Can I? Not today, not now, but can I?" He stopped. "I don't want to force anything. I don't want to make demands. I just need to know if there is any version of this where I can." "I don't know," Malene said. She said it honestly, and it surprised them both. She didn't know. That was the truth of it. The raw, uncomfortable truth she hadn't been able to arrive at in a full week of practiced certainty. She didn't know what version of this was possible, or what she was willing to allow, or what was right. She only knew that her son existed, and his father was standing in her cafe, and 10 years of silence had just cracked open down the middle, and she had no idea what was on the other side. "Go," she said. "I need you to just go." He went. He opened the door, and he went out into the rain. And the bell rang twice, and she stood alone in the middle of the cafe for a long time. Not moving, not cleaning, not making plans. Just breathing, which was sometimes the only thing you could manage. She turned off the lights. She locked the door. She drove home. Ethan was asleep. She stood in his doorway for a moment and looked at him. The small shape under the blanket, one hand curled near his face. The baseball posters on the wall, and the half-finished model on the desk, and the sneakers by the door with their laces still untied. She looked at her son. She did not know what she was going to do, but 3 miles away in a glass tower overlooking the lake, Nikolai Voss was sitting alone in a room that was all clean lines and expensive silence. And he was looking at his hands, and he was thinking about a boy with his eyes who had been alive for 10 years and whose name he had just learned tonight. And somewhere between the cafe on Monroe Street and that glass tower, whatever had been frozen between them for a decade had begun to move. Neither of them was ready for where it was going. The first thing Malene did Sunday morning was make coffee she didn't drink. She stood at the kitchen counter in the gray early light, listening to the machine work, watching the dark liquid fill the pot, and she thought about nothing in particular. That was a skill she had developed. The ability to blank out the interior, to run on surface-level function when the deeper levels were too loud to manage. Make coffee, pour orange juice, set out the cereal box, move through the motions of a morning until the morning became manageable. Ethan came out of his room at 7:40 with his hair standing up on one side and his socks mismatched. And she felt, as she always did, the specific gravity of him, the way his presence organized the room around itself without effort or intention. "There is no milk," he said, looking in the refrigerator. "I know," she said. "I'll get some today." He closed the refrigerator and looked at her with that sideways careful look. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I slept fine," she replied. "You have the tired lines," he pointed out. "The what?" "The lines," he gestured vaguely at his own face, indicating the area around the eyes. "You get them when you don't sleep." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Eat your cereal dry. It's fine." He ate his cereal dry without complaint, which was one of the things she loved about him. His capacity to adapt to small inconveniences without drama. He got that from her. The stubbornness he got from somewhere else. She didn't think about that. After he went to his room to work on the science project, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone, and she stared at it for a long time. She had no messages. She hadn't expected any. She had never given Nikolai her number, and she had changed it twice in 10 years anyway. But she sat there looking at the blank screen, as if it might tell her something useful about what came next. It didn't. She put the phone in her pocket, put on her coat, and went to get the milk. The grocery store was 4 blocks away, and she walked, because she always walked, when the distance was reasonable, because gas cost money. The storm had finally moved east overnight, and the morning was cold and clear, the sidewalks still dark with residual wet, the air carrying that specific smell of a city after rain, concrete and something faintly metallic, and the exhaust of buses. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her head down, which was how she walked everywhere. A habit she had developed without noticing it. A posture that said she was not available, she was going somewhere. She was not a person who could be stopped. She was halfway to the store when she realized she was being followed. Not the obvious kind. Not footsteps matching hers. Not a figure too close in her peripheral vision. Something subtler. A dark sedan that had been parked on her block was now idling at the intersection ahead. Its engine running, not pulling into traffic. She registered it the way you register things you don't understand yet. As a texture, a wrongness at the edge of awareness. She kept walking. At the corner, she glanced left. The sedan stayed where it was. She bought the milk. She walked home by a different route, not running, not looking back, just moving differently than she had moved on the way there. By the time she got to her building, the sedan was gone. She stood in her kitchen and she thought, this is what it looks like. This is what a decade of distance actually purchased. Not safety, not clean air, just a postponement. The thing she had spent 10 years keeping at arm's length had driven itself to her street and idled at her corner. The question was whether that was Nikolai's doing or someone else's. She didn't want to find out the answer. She called him at 9:15, which meant she had to get his number, which meant she had to call Marcus, who had a card for a private security service that had done work for the Café 2 years ago after a break-in. She had to ask him for the contact and explain nothing, and wait 20 minutes while Marcus did what Marcus did, which was ask no questions out loud and approximately 40 questions with his silence. The number she eventually dialed rang twice. Malene, his voice in the morning without warning. She hadn't prepared for that either. There was a car, she said, a dark sedan. It was outside my building this morning, and then it was at the corner ahead of me when I walked to the store. A pause. Short. What color sedan, he asked. Dark charcoal or black? 4-door license plate, he asked. I didn't get it. Okay, he said. His voice had changed. Not louder, but denser somehow. Compacted. Were you alone? He asked. Yes, I was alone. Ethan is home. Don't. She stopped herself, breathed. Was it yours? Another pause longer this time. No, he said. Are you sure? She asked. Yes. The word was flat and definite, and she believed it, which was a problem in itself. The fact that she still had an instinct for when he was being straight with her, 10 years later after everything. Then whose was it, she said. I don't know yet, he said. I am going to find out. And then before she could respond, don't go out today. Not until I absolutely not. Malene, you don't get to tell me to stay in my apartment. You've been in my life for 6 days. Someone is watching you, he said. I know that, she replied. And I'm telling you, whatever you're going to do about it, do it without making me into someone who waits at home while the men figure things out. Are we clear? The silence this time had a different quality, something in it that might on someone else have been the beginning of a reluctant respect. Clear, he said. She hung up. She sat down at the kitchen table and she shook for about 90 seconds, which she allowed herself because Ethan was in the other room and couldn't see it. And then she stopped. By Monday, the sedan was gone. By Tuesday, she had almost stopped checking for it. By Wednesday, Nikolai walked into the cafe at the usual time and sat at the usual table, and she brought him coffee. He said quietly so his men wouldn't hear, it was federal surveillance, not directed at you specifically. At me. You were adjacent to me on Saturday night. They noted the location. He paused. I don't think you're in their file. You checked, she asked. I had someone check, right, he said. She looked at him. Is that your version of an apology? Having someone access federal surveillance files. It's my version of making sure you're safe, he said. There's a difference. I know there is, she replied. She went back behind the counter. The cafe was half full that afternoon, which meant she couldn't afford the distraction of whatever was happening in the corner. But the distraction was there anyway, a persistent low-frequency noise at the edge of her attention. She caught herself looking at him twice. Both times he was looking back. At closing, when Marcus had gone and the last customer had left, Nikolai sent his men outside and stayed seated. She hadn't asked him to stay. She hadn't told him to leave either, and she registered that omission with the cold clarity that was replacing the shock of the previous week. He plays baseball, she said. She was wiping down tables, and she didn't stop moving when she said it. Little League, third base. He's better at fielding than hitting, but he won't admit that. Nikolai was very still. He builds models, ships mostly. He does it on the kitchen table, and he leaves the pieces everywhere. I've stepped on a whole piece in bare feet more times than I can count. She moved to the next table. He reads above his grade level. His teacher said he's exceptional. I don't know if she says that to everyone or just to the kids she means it about, but with Ethan, I think she means it. Malene, I'm not, he started. She stopped, looked at him. I'm not doing this for you, she said. I'm not giving you this because you deserve it. I'm telling you because he is real and he exists, and I'm not going to pretend he doesn't. And if you're going to keep sitting in this cafe, which apparently you are, then you should know what's at stake. He looked at her with that wrecked expression again, the one that had no edge to push against, nothing to be angry at. Just the plain damage of a man who had run very sophisticated calculations 10 years ago and arrived at an answer that was catastrophically wrong. Can I? He stopped. I want to meet him. No, she said. Eventually, he started. I said no, she repeated. Maybe not ever. He has a life and it doesn't include you. She set the cloth down on the table. He's going to ask questions. When a stranger starts showing up, he's going to notice and he's going to ask questions because that's who he is. And I don't have answers for those questions yet. So until I do, you stay away from him completely. That's not negotiable. I understand, he said. Do you? She asked. Yes, he replied. She picked up the cloth. She went back to work. Black coffee tomorrow, she said. Whatever's darkest. He left without another word. She didn't watch him go. That was Wednesday. Thursday, she came home to find Ethan standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression she recognized. The serious, closed face he wore when he was working through something hard and hadn't decided whether to voice it yet. What? She asked. There was a man at school today, he said. Her spine went cold. What man? Outside the gate during dismissal. He was just standing there. He wasn't doing anything, but he was looking at me. She set her bag down on the counter very deliberately so that her hands would have something to do. What did he look like? She asked. Ethan described him. Older, heavy-set, dark coat, standing across the street from the main gate, not on school property. He'd been there when the bell rang and gone by the time the buses left. Ethan had noticed because Ethan noticed things, because he was 10 years old and already had better instincts about wrongness than most adults, which was a thing Malene had always been proud of and was now for the first time terrified by. Did he talk to you? She asked. No, Ethan said. Did he come closer? No, he just looked. Okay, she said it calmly. He's probably waiting for someone from another class, but you were right to notice. You did the right thing telling me. She said it the way she said everything that scared her. Quietly, completely with no crack in the surface for the fear to show through. After Ethan went to bed, she called Nikolai. He answered on the first ring. She described what Ethan had described, and she heard something happen in the silence at his end. Not anger exactly, but the compression of it. The sound of a man pulling something back very hard before it could escape. Height, he asked. She relayed what Ethan had said. He asked 3 more questions, specific and technical, and she answered all of them. And then she said, tell me this isn't connected to you. A pause. Tell me, she said again, and her voice had gone to that place it went when she was past anger and into something colder. I don't know yet, he said. That's not the answer I need, she replied. I know, he said. His voice was tight, controlled. Malene, I need you to listen to me. I'm going to have someone on the school, not visible, not in a way that Ethan would notice, but someone will be there tomorrow and the day after until I understand what this is. You're going to put security on my son, she asked. Yes, he said, without asking me. I'm asking you now. She stood at the kitchen window, looking at the alley below, the dumpsters, and the chain link and the orange light of the street lamp. She thought about the sedan. She thought about the heavy-set man in the dark coat. She thought about Ethan's serious, closed face. Fine, she said, but I want to know who they are. Names, descriptions. I want to be able to recognize them. I'll send you the information tonight, he said, and I want daily updates, whatever you find out. Yes, he agreed. And if I tell you to pull them, you pull them. A pause. If you tell me to pull them, I'll tell you why you shouldn't, and then I'll pull them. It wasn't what she had asked for, but it was honest. And right now honest was more useful than compliant. Okay, she said. She put the phone down, and she stood at the window for a long time. By Friday, she had 4 names and physical descriptions, and a confirmation that each of them had already been positioned near Ethan's school and the route between home and the cafe. She read the file, and it was a real document with photographs and ID numbers and shift rotations. And she felt simultaneously safer and more comprehensively frightened than she had at any point in the previous 2 weeks. Because the existence of the file meant the threat was real enough to warrant the file. That afternoon, Nikolai arrived at the cafe with someone she hadn't seen before. A woman, 40 or so, with the kind of composed, watchful face that suggested she was not there as company. She sat at a separate table and opened a laptop and appeared to do nothing except exist in the room. "Who is she?" Malene asked when she brought Nikolai his coffee. "Analyst," he said. "She's been tracking the surveillance patterns. I asked her to brief me here." "You're working in my cafe," she said. "Is that a problem?" Malene looked at the woman who had not looked up from her laptop. "What did she find?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost surprise. Not that she had asked, but at the directness of it, the absence of flinching. Then he said, "The man at Ethan's school is connected to a group that was part of my father's network. Old organization, not mine. People who feel that the transition when I took control cost them something they were owed." "Cost them what?" she asked. "Territory, revenue. The kind of arrangements my father had in place that I dismantled when I took over." The phrase carried weight he didn't unpack. "They've been dormant for years. 3 of their principal operators were arrested on federal charges 18 months ago. The ones who are left are not rational actors. They don't have a plan. They have grievances, and they found out about me. They found out about the cafe, about the Saturday visit. The federal surveillance picked it up in federal surveillance leaks." He said it matter-of-factly. "The way you state a structural flaw in a system you've spent years navigating. I don't think they know about Ethan." "You don't think?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. "I'm trying to find out." Malene set his coffee down. She straightened up. She looked at the woman at the laptop and at the 2 suited men at their peripheral tables and at Nikolai. At the composure and the competence and the quiet machinery of protection he had deployed in her direction. And she felt something move in her that she did not want to name. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Handle it," he said. "That means what specifically?" she pressed. "It means the people who are watching your son are going to stop watching your son." "How?" He looked at her steadily. "You don't want the details." "Don't tell me what I want," she said. His voice dropped, not in volume but in register, and she felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. "There are things about how I operate that you should not know. Not because I'm hiding them from you, because knowing them puts you in a different position, legally and practically. I'm asking you to trust that this specific piece I handle the way I know how to handle it." She stood there and looked at him. She thought about everything he had said in this room over the past 2 weeks. She thought about Ethan at the kitchen door with his serious, closed face. She thought about what trust actually meant when you had given it once to this specific person and had it taken apart. "You have until Sunday," she said. "If that man is still near Ethan's school Monday morning, I'm going to the police. Not to protect you or avoid complications, because that's what you do when someone is watching your child. Are we clear?" "Clear," he said. She walked back to the counter. At 4:15, Marcus came out of the back and looked at the room. At the woman with the laptop, at the 2 suited men, at Nikolai in the corner. And then he looked at Malene with the look that had been building for 2 weeks. The look that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but contained elements of both. "My office," he said. "When you have a minute." She had a minute. She followed him in. He closed the door. He sat on the edge of his desk and crossed his arms, and he looked at her. Marcus, when he looked at you like that, was not a comfortable experience. He was 56 years old and had owned this cafe for 20 years. Before that, he had run a bar on the west side, and before that he had done things he didn't discuss. And the sum of all that experience was a man who understood when a situation had become something other than what it appeared to be. "That is Nikolai Voss," he said. "Marcus." "I know who he is," Malene replied. "I've lived in the city for 30 years. That's Nikolai Voss sitting at my corner table every day for 2 weeks with 2 security personnel and now an analyst. She didn't say anything. What is he to you? He asked. She looked at Marcus at his crossed arms and his careful eyes and his 30 years of knowing when a question mattered, and she said he's Ethan's father. The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at the ceiling briefly, a gesture she had seen him make before when absorbing something he hadn't expected. Then he looked back at her. Does he know that? He found out last week. Does Ethan know? No. Marcus uncrossed his arms. He sat with his hands flat on his knees and he breathed carefully for a moment. Okay, he said. Okay. What do you need from me? She hadn't expected that. She'd expected argument, concern. The careful, reasonable voice of a man laying out why this was a bad idea. All of which she had already said to herself. She hadn't expected him to ask what she needed. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Okay, he said, standing up. You let me know. She went back out to the floor. She worked the remaining 2 hours of her shift with the careful mechanical efficiency she had developed over 3 years. And she didn't look at the corner table more than she had to, and she told herself she was managing this situation, and she almost believed it. Saturday morning, the heavy-set man in the dark coat was not at Ethan's school. He wasn't there Sunday either, because there was no school Sunday. But the route between home and the cafe was clear. The car that Marcus's security contact had flagged 2 weeks ago did not appear on their block again. She didn't ask Nikolai what he had done. She told herself it was because she didn't want the details. That was partially true. The other part was that she was starting to be afraid of how much easier it was becoming to stand in the same room as him. How the edge of the first week, the full-body alarm of his presence, the way her whole system had reared up against him, was shading into something more complex. She was afraid of complex. Complex was how she'd ended up here the first time. On Sunday evening, she was helping Ethan finish his science project. It was a model of the water cycle, which he'd constructed from a plastic container and a heat lamp, and a level of structural precision that she found genuinely impressive. He said without looking up from the tubing he was adjusting, "Is someone watching our building?" She went very still. "What makes you ask that?" "There's a man," he said. "Not the same one as at school. Different man. He sits in a car across the street sometimes." Ethan looked up. "He's always there when you come home from work. He was there Thursday and Friday and this morning." She looked at her son at his 10-year-old face, with its economy of expression, its patient waiting. "He's someone I asked to keep an eye on things," she said. It was as close to true as she could get, without being all the way true. "Why?" he asked. "Because I wanted to be careful." "Careful about what?" "Ethan." "Mom," he said it quietly, not with a child's impatience, but with something older. "I'm not 6. You can tell me when something's wrong. I'd rather know." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she had kept from him and all the reasons she had had. She thought about what he had said. "I'd rather know." She thought about the water cycle model on the table with its precise tubing and careful architecture, the model her son had built by himself over 4 days, because when Ethan decided to build something, he built it correctly. "There's someone I used to know," she said. "He's come back into our life, and I'm figuring out what that means. And while I'm figuring it out, I wanted someone to be careful." "Okay." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "Is it someone bad?" She thought about the question. Thought about Nikolai at the corner table. Thought about the file with the photographs and the shift rotations and the heavy-set man who had stopped appearing. "I don't think so," she said. "Not anymore." Ethan nodded slowly, processing it in his way. He went back to the tubing. Then he said, "Is it my dad?" The word went through the room like a change in temperature, like the air itself had rearranged. Malene set down the scissors she had been holding. She breathed. She looked at her son, who was not looking at her, who was adjusting a connection in the model with the focused, careful attention he gave to everything. Ethan was still looking at the tubing when Malene answered him. She didn't answer immediately. She sat with the question for a full 4 seconds. Long enough that Ethan looked up from the model. Long enough that he saw her face and understood the 4 seconds were their own kind of answer. "Yeah," she said. 1 word. She'd spent 10 years building walls, and she took them down in 1 word for her son because he had asked her directly, and he was 10 years old and he deserved that much. Ethan looked at her. He didn't cry. He didn't get up from the table. He looked at her the way he looked at problems, with a focused, patient attention, turning it over, checking its dimensions. Does he know about me? He said he found out recently. What does he want? I don't know yet, she said. We're still figuring that out. Ethan nodded. He went back to the tubing. She watched him work for a moment. The steady hands, the careful movements. The 10-year-old boy, absorbing information that would have undone an adult and converting it into something he could build around. She thought about how she'd made him. Not the biology of it, the character of it, the specific person he'd become in the years she had been the only one. Okay, Ethan said finally. Just that. She didn't push it. She let him have the okay, and she went back to helping with the model. They worked in silence for another hour, and the water cycle took shape between them. Precise and functional, the way Ethan built everything. She lay awake until 2 in the morning. Monday came in cold and sharp, the first real freeze of the season. There was frost on the car windshields, and the breath of pedestrians was visible in the early light. Malene dropped Ethan at school and scanned the street the way she'd been scanning streets for 2 weeks. She was looking for the heavy-set man, for the dark sedan, for anything that sat wrong against the ordinary texture of the morning. Nothing. The street was just a street. She was 3 blocks from the cafe when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She answered it. Miss Hartwell, a man's voice. Older, with the particular flatness of someone who made calls like this, often enough that the discomfort had worn off. My name is Agent Devin Cross. I'm with the FBI Organized Crime Division. I was hoping we could speak. She stopped walking. She was on the sidewalk between a dry cleaner and a sandwich place, and the wind was coming off the lake with real teeth in it. She stood there and felt the cold hit the back of her neck. About what? She said. About Nikolai Voss and your association with him. She started walking again. Moving was better than standing still. I serve him coffee, she said. Miss Hartwell, we've had surveillance on Mr. Voss for approximately 14 months. During that time, you've become a point of regular contact. We'd like to understand the nature of that contact. I'm a barista. He's a customer. He visited your place of residence on a Saturday evening 3 weeks ago. She kept walking. She kept her voice even. What do you want from me? She asked. A conversation. Nothing formal. We're not asking you to do anything. I need to call you back, she said. Miss Hartwell, he began. She hung up. She stood outside the cafe door with her key in her hand, and she breathed the cold air. She thought, this is what it looks like when the walls start coming down. Not the walls she had built between herself and Nikolai. The walls between her ordinary life and whatever his life was. Those walls had been in place for 10 years, and they were coming apart in real time. And she was standing in the wreckage in a coffee-stained coat, trying to figure out which way was out. She went inside. She made coffee. She opened the cafe. At 10, she called Nikolai. FBI, she said when he picked up. An Agent Cross called me this morning. He knows you came to my building. He wants a conversation. The pause was short. Don't speak to them without a lawyer, he said. I know that I'm not an idiot. What I want to know is how exposed I am. You're not a target, he replied. That's not what I asked. Malene, am I a person they're going to use to get to you? Yes or no? A longer pause. Potentially, he said, which is why you need a lawyer before any conversation. I can't afford a lawyer, Nikolai. I'll send someone. Absolutely not, she said. Malene, listen. If I take your lawyer, I become your person. That's how it works. Then I'm not a witness. I'm an associate. And that is a completely different set of problems. She could hear herself, the precision of it. The law school she'd left behind at 21 surfacing like muscle memory. The language of it still fluent even after 10 years of disuse. I need someone independent, she said. I know someone independent, he offered. Former federal prosecutor, no connection to my organization. He takes private clients. I'll cover the fee as a what? As a father. The word came out with a weight that was different from everything else he'd said. Deliberate, claimed. She stood at the counter with the phone against her ear. And she looked at the empty cafe, the 12 tables, and the rain on the window, and the espresso machine cycling through its idle routine. She thought about what he just said and the way he had said it. Send me the name, she said. I'll make my own call. She hung up. The lawyer's name was Gerald Pratt. She called him at 11, spoke for 12 minutes, and had an appointment for Wednesday afternoon. He asked 3 questions. He did not ask about Nikolai Voss directly, which told her he already knew who she was calling about, which told her Nikolai had called ahead anyway. She filed that away. At noon, a man she'd never seen came into the cafe. He was young, mid-20s maybe, with an ordinary face and ordinary clothes, and the specific quality of blankness that Méline had learned to read over the past 2 weeks as deliberate. He ordered a coffee, paid cash, sat at a table near the center of the room with his back to the window. He was still there when Nikolai arrived at 2:50. Nikolai saw him immediately. He didn't change his direction or his pace. He went to the corner table. His 2 men positioned themselves. He sat down, but she saw the look that went between Nikolai and the young man with the ordinary face. Brief, transactional, the look of 2 people confirming something they already knew. She brought Nikolai his coffee. "The man in the center," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Who is he?" "Crosses people," Nikolai said. "Just that." She straightened up. She looked at the cafe, at the FBI surveillance agent drinking her coffee, at Nikolai Voss in her corner, at the 12 tables and the rain and the machinery of her ordinary life, now entirely populated by extraordinary problems. And she felt something that was close to a dark, humorless laugh. She went back behind the counter. She worked. The ordinary-faced young man drank his coffee slowly and left at 4. She watched him go. That evening at Ethan's school, there was a science fair preview, an informal event where students could bring parents to see the projects before the official competition on Friday. Méline arrived at 5:30 with Ethan's water cycle model in a box. They set it up at his assigned table. She stood with him while he explained the mechanics to the other parents who stopped to look, and she watched him talk. The careful precision of his explanations, the way he handled questions seriously, the occasional flash of that gap-toothed smile when someone understood the thing he was showing them. She was proud of him in a way that had no bottom. That was the only way she'd ever found to describe it, a pride that went all the way down. At 6:15, she looked toward the gymnasium door and saw Nikolai standing just inside it. He was in the back near the wall, wearing a plain dark jacket, no coat, no suit, nothing that would read as expensive from a distance. His security was not visible, which meant they were outside or positioned in a way she couldn't see. He was alone, or appeared to be, and he was looking at Ethan's table with an expression that she had no framework for. She excused herself from the parent she had been talking to. She crossed the gymnasium. She stopped beside him. "You said you'd stay away," she said very quietly. "I know this is not staying away," he replied. "I know." He didn't look at her. He was still looking at Ethan, who was across the room explaining water vapor to a classmate's father. "I just needed to see him. I won't approach him. I'm not going to do anything. I just needed to see him in a room." She stood beside him, and she looked at her son, and she thought about all the things she could say. She said none of them because standing beside Nikolai Voss, watching Ethan Hartwell explain a water cycle model, she felt something shift in the place where she'd been holding the shape of the last 10 years. Some load-bearing thing moving slightly, not collapsing, just adjusting. She hated it. 10 minutes, she said. Then you leave before he sees you. He stayed 8 minutes. He didn't move from the wall. He just watched. When he left, she didn't see him go. She was back at Ethan's table. But she felt the temperature of the room change slightly, the way it always did when he was no longer in it. On the drive home, Ethan said there was a man in the back of the gym. She kept her eyes on the road. "Yeah," she said. "He looked at me a lot. I know." "Was that him?" she breathed. "Yeah." Ethan looked out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. "He's tall," he said, and then nothing else, all the way home. Wednesday arrived with the first real ice of the season and the meeting with Gerald Pratt, who was 60 and direct, and asked her questions in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a building on LaSalle Street. She answered all of them. He listened without writing anything down, which she recognized as the habit of a man who had learned that notes could become evidence. At the end, he said she was not a target. They want Voss. "You're a potential pressure point." He paused. "The question is whether you're willing to be." "I'm not," she said. "Then don't speak to them." Don't confirm or deny any relationship. If they approach you again, you have my number." He stood. He did not offer a bill. She didn't ask about one. She was in the elevator going down when her phone rang. It was one of Nikolai's men, not Nikolai. One of the men, which was unusual. She answered. The voice was tight. "Mr. Voss asked me to call you. There's been a development. He'd like to meet tonight if possible." "What kind of development?" she asked. A pause. "He'd prefer to explain in person." She met him at 8 in a restaurant she'd never been to. The kind with no sign outside and no menu at the table, and 4 other occupied tables that she suspected had been populated by Nikolai's people. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when she came in. She noticed the standing. She didn't comment on it. She sat down across from him, and she looked at his face, and she said before he could speak, "What happened?" "The people we've been tracking," he said. "The remnants of my father's network. The ones I told you were not rational actors." He stopped. He moved a glass on the table slightly. A small movement with no purpose. She'd noticed him do that before. The small physical displacement when he was managing something difficult. One of them reached out to an associate of mine this afternoon, not to negotiate, to deliver a message. "What message?" she asked. He looked at her. "They know about Ethan." The room did not change. The temperature did not drop. The 4 tables of probably security personnel continued their quiet performance of being diners. None of these things changed. And yet Malene felt as though the floor had moved. "How?" she asked. "The science fair preview last night. I was there longer than I should have been, and I was seen by someone I didn't account for. Someone who knew who I was and understood what it meant that I was watching a specific child." His voice was flat and controlled, and underneath it she could hear for the first time something that was not under control. "I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I am responsible for." "Stop." She put her hand flat on the table, not touching him, just stopping the sentence. "What exactly did the message say?" He told her. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment, not processing it exactly, more like holding it at arm's length before allowing herself to understand its full weight. "They're going to use him," she said. "They're going to try to get to you." "Yes." She looked at him across the table. She looked at the man who had come into her cafe 3 weeks ago and broken open 10 years of sealed history, and brought the federal government to her phone and the remnants of a criminal organization to her son's school. And she thought about everything she had said and done in those 3 weeks. Every careful measured step she'd taken to maintain some control over how much of his world touched her life. Every bit of it was ash. "Ethan needs to leave the city," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Tonight I have a place." "Not your place," she said. "There is someone. My mother's sister. She's in Portland. Ethan's been there twice. He knows her. He won't panic if I explain it correctly." She was already doing the arithmetic. School. The science fair Friday. She made herself let go of the science fair. His baseball cleats were at the apartment. He'd need those. She was planning logistics for moving her child out of the city in the next 4 hours, and she was doing it with the same flat precision she used to plan the monthly budget. "I'll call her tonight. I'll put him on a morning flight. I can arrange it," Nikolai said. "I'll buy the ticket." "Malene, I will buy the ticket." Her voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised. It was compressed to its essential structure, the way metal compresses under load. "I will put my son on a plane, and I will buy the ticket, and you will give me every piece of information you have about these people. And then we are going to figure out how to end this, not manage it. End it. Because I am not moving my child out of his home and his school and his life for this to still be happening in 6 months." Nikolai looked at her across the table. The restaurant was very quiet. Outside, the first real ice of November was coming down on Chicago, coating the streets, turning everything rigid and still. "Tell me what you need," he said. "Everything," she said. "Starting with who they are, how many of them, where they're based, and what it would actually take to make them stop." She picked up her water glass and set it down without drinking. "And I want the truth, not the version you think I can handle. The actual truth." He held her gaze. Then he reached into his jacket and put a flash drive on the table between them. "Everything I know," he said. 14 months of intelligence, names, locations, financial structures, federal files we've obtained through channels. He paused, Some of it's going to be hard to look at. I've been doing hard for 10 years, she said. This is different, he warned. Put it on the table and let me decide that. He left it on the table. She picked it up. It was small and unremarkable in her palm. A small thing to contain the architecture of the threat against her son. She stood up. She put her coat on. She looked at Nikolai Voss one more time across the quiet restaurant. I'm going home to pack a bag for Ethan, she said. When he's on the plane tomorrow morning, I'll call you, and then we're going to finish this. She walked out into the ice. Her phone was already at her ear before she reached the sidewalk, calling her aunt in Portland. And her voice, when her aunt picked up, was steady and warm and gave away nothing because Ethan would be listening. And what Ethan needed right now was the sound of his mother having everything under control. She had nothing under control. But she had the flash drive in her pocket and the cold against her face and the specific furious clarity that comes when someone threatens the one thing you have spent your entire life protecting. And in that moment, Malene Hartwell understood something she hadn't understood before. She wasn't going to survive Nikolai Voss's world by staying on the edges of it. She was going to have to walk straight into the center of it. That was what she'd said. Standing on the ice sidewalk outside the restaurant. And that was what she did. Not metaphorically, not gradually, but in the concrete and literal sense of a woman who had made a decision and was now executing it with the same flat precision she applied to everything that mattered. She went home. She packed Ethan's bag while he slept. 3 days of clothes, his baseball glove because he'd asked about it, the book he was halfway through, his phone charger. She did it without turning on the overhead light, moving by the lamp in the hallway, and she was so careful and so quiet that he didn't stir once. She stood in his doorway for a moment when the bag was packed, and she looked at him. The small shape under the blanket, one hand near his face. And she took a breath, and she closed the door. At 5:45, she woke him. She told him the truth, or the version of it a 10-year-old could use. Some people who didn't like the man she'd been spending time with had found out about him. And until that situation was resolved, he was going to stay with Aunt Carol in Portland. She said it quietly and without drama, sitting on the edge of his bed with the lamp on. And Ethan listened to all of it with his eyes fully open and his face in that careful, composed configuration that was older than his age. How long? He asked. I don't know yet. 2 weeks maybe. Could be less. What about the science fair? The science fair. She'd been waiting for that. I'll talk to your teacher. We'll figure something out. He looked at her. He was deciding whether to argue, and she could see him deciding it, watching the calculation move through his face. Then he sat up and said okay, and started getting dressed. She drove him to O'Hare at 6:30 in the dark and the ice through streets that were still empty, the city not yet awake. They didn't talk much. At the gate, she had paid for the ticket that allowed her to walk him to the gate, had put the charge on the card she kept for emergencies. He put his backpack on, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said the things they were thinking. She hugged him. He hugged back with both arms tight the way he'd hugged her, since he was small. She felt him against her, and she breathed once slow and deep, taking inventory. Call me when you land, she said. I know, he said. Call me, Ethan. Don't text. Call. I know, Mom. She watched him walk down the jetway. She watched until he was gone. Then she turned around and walked back through the terminal and out into the freezing pre-dawn of Chicago. And she took out her phone and she called Nikolai. He's on the plane, she said. Now show me everything. They met at a location she hadn't been to. A building in the West Loop that looked like a disused commercial space from the outside and was something entirely different on the inside. She was taken up 2 floors by one of Nikolai's men, who didn't speak, and brought into a room that had the quality of a place where serious things happened. Large monitors, a long table, maps of the city printed and pinned to corkboards, a whiteboard covered in names and lines and numbers she didn't understand yet. Nikolai was there, and the analyst she'd seen in the café, whose name turned out to be Dana Ferris, and 2 men she hadn't met, both of them with the particular attentiveness of people who lived by their physical competence. No one offered her coffee. She didn't want any. Sit, Nikolai said. Tell me who they are first, she said. She stayed standing. He told her his name was Gerald Marsh. Not the man at the school, not the man in the sedan, but the man behind both of them. 61 years old, former financial operations director for Nikolai's father's organization. The man who had managed the money for 15 years and had expected when the old boss died to be retained in that role. Instead, Nikolai had dismantled the financial structure entirely, surrendered assets to federal authorities as part of a quiet arrangement, and Gerald Marsh had lost approximately $40 million in projected future earnings and the better part of his professional identity. "He's not a soldier," Nikolai said. "He's an administrator with resources and a grievance. He's hired people. He's been patient. He waited until he understood what I cared about. And now he knows about Ethan," she said. "Yes," he replied. "Where is he?" she asked. "That's what we're working on." She sat down. She pulled the flash drive from her pocket and she plugged it into the laptop. Ferris pushed toward her and she started reading. She read for 2 hours. Nikolai worked around her. Phone calls conducted in low voices. Conversations with the two men she didn't know. Ferris updating markers on the digital map. Malene read. Her old training surfaced in the reading. The ability to move through dense material quickly, to identify what mattered and what was connective tissue, to hold multiple threads simultaneously without losing the structure. She hadn't used it in 10 years, but it was still there. Like a language you'd stopped speaking that came back when you needed it. At 9:15, she spoke. "The storage facility, the one on the west side near Cicero, Marsh has been using it as a transfer point. It's in 3 separate documents in this file, noted as a consistent location across an 18-month period. Has anyone flagged it?" she asked. "We flagged it," Ferris said. 2 weeks ago," Nikolai said. "We've had eyes on it. Movement's been intermittent." "There was movement yesterday morning," said one of the men she didn't know. 2 vehicles in, 1 out. "We didn't follow the one that left." She looked at Nikolai. "That was after the science fair," she said. "Yes." She looked at the map. She looked at the storage facility marker on the west side, the cluster of other markers around it. Residences, a cash business, a defunct import company that had been used as a mail address. She traced the connections the way she'd traced legal arguments once a long time ago. "He's consolidating," she said. "He's nervous. He made his move by identifying Ethan, and now he's waiting to see what you do. He's pulled his people closer." Nikolai looked at her. "That's what we think." "When?" she asked. "Tonight, probably," he said. "If he's going to use what he has, he'll want to move before." Her phone rang, Portland area code. She answered it before the second ring. "Mom." Ethan's voice, steady and careful. "I landed." She breathed out. "Good. Is Aunt Carol there?" "She's here, Mom." A pause. A very particular pause. "There was a man on the plane in the row behind me. He talked to me. The room went cold." "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he was a friend of yours," Ethan said. His voice still controlled, still careful, and underneath the control, she could hear the 10-year-old working very hard to hold the thing together. "He said to tell you that the flight arrived safely. He said you'd understand what that meant." She was on her feet. She didn't remember standing. "Where is he now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "He left when we got off the plane." "Mom, am I in danger? Listen to me. You are safe. Aunt Carol is right there with you. You stay with her and you do not leave her side. Do you hear me? Not for anything." "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to call you back in 10 minutes. Don't go anywhere." She hung up. She turned to Nikolai. The expression on her face was not fear. Fear had burned off somewhere in the last 30 seconds. And what was left was something that had no patience for distance or caution, or the measured language of people managing a situation. "He put someone on the plane," she said, "with Ethan to let me know he could." Nikolai had gone absolutely still. "He knows where Ethan is," she said. "Portland isn't safe. Aunt Carol's house isn't safe. There is nowhere I can send him that this man can't find him." She stopped. She stopped because the sentence was going somewhere she couldn't follow out loud. Somewhere that was all the way down to the bedrock of the worst thing. "I'm getting him back," she said. "Get him on a plane back to Chicago tonight. I want him where I can see him." "Malene," Nikolai's voice was very controlled. "If you bring him back here before Marsh is contained, then contain him." She looked at him across the table. "Tonight, you said tonight is when he moves. Then you move first. You end this tonight, and you do it before my son gets on another plane." The room was very quiet. The two men she didn't know were looking at Nikolai. Ferris had stopped typing. Nikolai held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the men. "How fast can we be ready?" 2 hours, said the one who'd spoken before. 1, Nikolai said. Malene called her aunt. She spoke calmly. She told her to keep Ethan inside, doors locked. Do not answer the door for anyone she didn't know. She'd call back within 2 hours with further instructions. Her aunt asked one question. Malene answered it. She hung up. She looked at Nikolai. "I'm coming," she said. "No," he replied. "Non-negotiable. Malene, this is not an option. My son is in Portland with a man who can apparently put surveillance on a commercial flight. You're going after the person responsible tonight. I'm not sitting in this room watching a map." She looked at him with the full weight of everything she'd been carrying for 3 weeks, 3 years, 10 years. "I'm not a principal in your operation. I'm not going to pick up a weapon, but I am going to be there when this ends because he used my child and I need to see it finished. That's not negotiable, and I'm not asking." Nikolai looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation. The security risk against the cost of refusing her, the operational logic against the other thing. The thing that wasn't operational at all. She watched him land on his answer. "You stay behind the perimeter," he said. "You do exactly what I tell you, the moment I tell you. If I say get down, you get down. If I say move, you move. If I say go back to the vehicle, you go back to the vehicle without discussion." "Agreed." "I mean it, Malene. I know you do." They moved within the hour. 4 vehicles. She was in the second one between Ferris, who turned out not to be just an analyst, and a man named Reyes, who said nothing during the entire drive. His hands were very still in his lap. The stillness of someone who had learned to conserve everything until it was needed. Nikolai was in the lead vehicle. She couldn't see him, but she could track the lead vehicle's tail lights through the windshield. The only things that seemed fixed in the movement and the dark. Chicago at midnight in November is a specific kind of cold. The ice from earlier had refrozen into a hard shell over everything, and the streets in the industrial corridor near Cicero were empty and orange-lit and absolutely still. They came in from 3 directions, which she understood from the radio traffic that moved between the vehicles in short bursts of code she didn't have the key for. Her vehicle stopped at the end of a block. Engine running, lights off. Ferris put a hand on her arm. "Not forceful, just here." "We wait here," Ferris said. She waited. 4 minutes of silence broken only by the radio. She watched the building at the end of the block. A low, flat-roofed storage facility behind a chain-link fence. Lights on inside. 2 vehicles visible in the lot. She breathed. She thought about Ethan in a house in Portland, sitting with his aunt, holding it together the way he always held things together. She thought about him on the plane with a stranger in the row behind him, and her whole body went tight with a rage, so clean it was almost like clarity. Then from inside the facility a light went out. Then another. Then the radio crackled with a voice she recognized as the man called Reyes, who was no longer in the vehicle beside her. And what the voice said was 2 words. "He is running." Everything moved at once. The lead vehicle pulled forward fast. Ferris was out of the door. Malene was out behind her, without making a decision to be. She was simply outside, the cold air hitting her like a wall. The facility's lit exterior ahead of her, figures moving at the fence line. A door on the near side of the building burst open. A man came through it at a run, older, heavy-set in a coat she almost recognized from Ethan's description before she understood. It was the same coat. The man from the school, one of Marcia's people. He crossed the lot toward the vehicles. And then one of Nikolai's men came around the corner of the building, and the man turned and changed direction. For 3 seconds he was running directly toward her. She didn't move. She stood at the edge of the lot in the frozen dark, and she looked at him coming toward her, and she did not move. He was 15 feet away when Reyes came from behind a vehicle and hit him so hard and so efficiently that the man was on the ground before she'd fully processed that it had happened. Reyes had the man's arms pinned and was saying something in a low, hard voice, and the man on the ground was saying nothing. She breathed. Inside the building, there were sounds she didn't try to interpret. Voices, the crack of something hard against something harder. A single shout that cut off quickly. The radio kept moving. Then Nikolai's voice in her earpiece. Ferris had given her an earpiece in the vehicle, and she'd put it in without being told to. Nikolai's voice, low and controlled. We have him. Most of the overhead fluorescents were out, and the remaining ones threw everything into hard contrast, bright and shadow, no middle ground. She went inside. Gerald Marsh was seated in a chair at the far end of the space, not restrained, seated, which she understood was a particular choice, a particular message. He was in his 60s, and he looked it. A man with the soft administrative face of someone who had spent his career at a remove from the physical consequences of his decisions. Nikolai stood in front of him. 3 of Nikolai's men occupied the room's perimeter. She stopped 10 feet away. Marsh looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who had calculated badly and was still trying to find the error in his own math. You brought her here, he said to Nikolai. Something that was almost amused, almost contemptuous, interesting. Tell her what you told me, Nikolai said. Marsh looked at Malene. Your son is fine. The man on the plane was a message, nothing more. Where is he? She asked. The man on the plane? Gone. He's done. It was a demonstration, not a threat. You put a stranger next to my 10-year-old on a commercial flight, and you're telling me it wasn't a threat? I'm telling you, he's not in danger. I needed Nikolai to understand the scope of what I could do. The child was a data point. She looked at this man. She looked at him carefully. The soft face and the calculated eyes and the $50 word he just used for her son. She felt the rage move through her, the way cold moves through you, starting from the center and going outward. What do you want? She asked. Marsh shifted his attention to Nikolai. What I've always wanted, what I was owed. The money that was surrendered. It's gone, Nikolai said. There are structures that can be rebuilt, Marsh insisted. It's gone, Gerald. It went to federal accounts 18 months ago. I cannot give you money that doesn't exist. Then give me what does exist. Marsh's voice had changed, the administrative calm cracking slightly, something raw underneath. I gave your father 15 years. 15 years of building something that should have been mine when he died. You walked in and burned it down and handed the ashes to the government, and I want what I'm owed. You're owed nothing, Nikolai said. You worked for my father's organization. The organization is gone. The contract ended. That's not how it works, Marsh said. That's exactly how it works. Nikolai's voice had gone to its flattest register, the one that had no edge because it didn't need one. And if you touch my son again. The words stopped the room. My son. Malene heard it. Marsh heard it. Everyone in the room heard it. Nikolai heard himself say it and didn't pull it back. Marsh looked between them. She watched him recalibrate, saw the moment he understood something he hadn't understood when they walked in. The full picture of what he'd stumbled into. You didn't know, he said slowly. Before the cafe, you didn't know about the boy. That's not your business, Nikolai said. That's why you came back. Marsh almost laughed, and the laugh was ugly. All of this, the cafe, the surveillance, the dismantling, none of that was about me at all. You came back for her, and you found out about the child, and now here we are. Gerald Nikolai's voice was very quiet. Stop talking. You think this is over? You think whatever arrangement you've made with the feds will save you? I said stop. Marsh stopped. He looked at Nikolai, and he looked at Malene, and he made the final calculation of a man who had run out of leverage and knew it. What happens now? He asked. Nikolai reached into his jacket and put a phone on the table beside Marsh's chair. You're going to call Agent Cross at the FBI. You're going to confirm that you've been in contact with his office as an informant regarding the remaining structures of the Voss organization. And you're going to complete that arrangement, all of it. Every account, every name, every structure you have knowledge of. He paused. In exchange, the federal charges currently being prepared against you for obstruction and financial conspiracy get reduced to something you can manage. Marsh looked at the phone. You arranged this. I arranged it 6 weeks ago. I was waiting for you to give me a reason to use it. You used your own son as a trap. I didn't know about my son 6 weeks ago. The quiet in Nikolai's voice had reached its absolute zero. He was never part of the calculation. If he had been, I would have ended this differently. The room held that for a moment. Malene looked at Nikolai. She looked at the side of his face, the jaw muscle working, the total stillness of the rest of him. The man who had spent 6 weeks building a trap for Gerald Marsh and had found out in the middle of executing it that his 10-year-old son had been used as a pressure point in it. She thought about what that cost him. She didn't say it out loud. There was no version of this room where she was going to say it out loud. Marsh picked up the phone. He made the call. It took 11 minutes. When it was done, Cross's people were at the facility within 22 minutes, which meant they'd been staged nearby. Which meant Nikolai's arrangement was exactly as complete as he'd said it was. She watched federal agents move through the space with their lights and their vests and their procedural voices. She stood against the wall with Ferris beside her, and she thought, this is what the end of something looks like. Not clean, not quiet, just done. Nikolai came to stand beside her while the agents worked. They stood shoulder to shoulder looking at the room. He didn't touch her. She didn't move away. Is it over? She asked. Marsh is done, he said. The people he hired will scatter. There are 2 others I need to find. He stopped. It's not entirely over, but Ethan can come home. She pulled out her phone. She called Portland. Her aunt answered, and she heard in the background Ethan's voice asking something. She said, "Let me talk to him." Ethan came on the line. "Hey," she said. "Hey." His voice was steady, but she could hear underneath it. The long, careful day of holding something very heavy. The exhaustion of a 10-year-old who had been braver than he should have had to be. "You can come home," she said. "I'll get you on a morning flight. It's over." A pause. Then, "Is everyone okay?" She looked at the room, at the agents and the monitors, and Nikolai, standing 2 feet away, staring at the floor with his hands in his coat pockets. "Yeah," she said. "Everyone's okay." "Okay," Ethan said, and then very quietly so that only she could hear it, "Is he there?" She looked at Nikolai. "Yeah," she said. "He's here." Another pause longer. Then Ethan said, "Tell him I want to meet him. For real. Not from across a gym." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Just one." "I'll tell him," she said. She hung up. She stood in the freezing industrial space, with the federal agents moving around her, and the adrenaline draining out of her system and leaving something raw and exhausted in its place. She stood there and she turned to Nikolai and she said, "He wants to meet you." His words. Nikolai looked at her. The expression on his face was not the controlled, compressed expression she'd been reading for 3 weeks. It was something below that, something that had no armor on it at all. He didn't say anything. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in the space between them was 10 years of wrong choices and impossible costs, and a boy with dark eyes who had held himself together on a plane and in a stranger's house and on a phone call at midnight, and who wanted at the end of all of it to meet his father. Nikolai drove her home. She didn't ask him to. He simply fell into step beside her when she walked out of the facility and opened the passenger door of the lead vehicle without making it a question. And she got in because her legs were tired and the cold was deep now past midnight. The kind of cold that had moved through her coat and settled somewhere in the bones. They drove through empty Chicago in silence. The ice on the streets caught the streetlights and threw them back in fragments. The city at this hour had a stripped quality. All the daytime performance gone, just the structure of the thing, the bones of it. Concrete and steel, and the dark water of the lake somewhere to the east. She looked out the window and she let herself be still for the first time in 18 hours. "You should sleep," he said. "I will, Malene." "I said I will." He drove. She looked at the city outside her building. He stopped the vehicle and she reached for the door. He said quietly, "Thank you." She stopped with her hand on the door. "For what?" "For not falling apart. When Ethan called, you didn't fall apart. You kept moving." A pause. "I know what that costs." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about saying several things and said none of them. "Good night." "Nikolai," she said. And she got out of the car and she went upstairs and she sat on the edge of her bed in her coat and she looked at the wall for a while. And then she lay down, coat still on, and she slept for 6 hours without moving. Ethan's plane landed at 11:14 the next morning. She was at the gate. He came off the jetway with his backpack on both shoulders and his sneakers untied. And when he saw her, his face did the thing it did sometimes. Broke open suddenly, the serious composure replaced by something younger and less defended. He walked faster, and she went to meet him, and she held on. "I was fine," he said into her shoulder. "I know. I wasn't scared. I know you weren't." She felt him breathe. She breathed with him. On the drive home, He asked questions she answered as honestly as she could, calibrated to what a 10-year-old could use. When they got to the apartment, he dropped his bag in his room and came back out and stood in the kitchen doorway. "When do I meet him?" he asked. "When you're ready." "I'm ready now." She looked at her son, the gap-toothed, serious face, the untied sneakers, the absolute certainty of a person who had spent the night in a strange city and had come home and was already moving toward the next thing. She thought about how she'd made him. She thought about what he'd inherited from her and what he'd inherited from somewhere else. "Saturday," she said. "We'll do Saturday." Ethan nodded. He went to his room. She heard him unzipping his bag, heard the familiar sounds of him unpacking and resettling. And she stood in the kitchen, and she put her hands flat on the counter, and she pressed down hard. She breathed until the pressure behind her eyes receded. She called Nikolai at noon. "Saturday," she said. Neutral ground. Somewhere public, somewhere Ethan chooses. A silence that had a texture to it, something careful in it, something that didn't want to move wrong. "Whatever he wants," Nikolai said. "He'll probably say a diner. Then a diner. Don't bring your security." A longer silence. "Malene, I need it to look normal. He needs it to look like two people having breakfast, not a summit." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes. One of your people can sit outside in a car. I'll allow that." "Okay." And Nikolai, she stopped, organized what she needed to say. Let him lead it. Whatever pace he sets, however much or little he wants to talk, you will his lead. He's 10. He doesn't owe you anything. I know he doesn't. I need to hear you say that you understand that. "He doesn't owe me anything," Nikolai said, flat and undefended. "The debt runs the other way." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen with the winter light coming through the window. And she thought about Saturday and about what it meant that she was arranging it instead of refusing it. And about all the distances she'd maintained for 10 years that were now simply gone. Not destroyed dramatically, not surrendered, just worn away by the accumulation of too many nights and too many choices. Until what remained was the truth, that the wall between her life and his was not protecting Ethan anymore. It may not have been protecting him for a while. She went to the cafe that afternoon. Marcus was there. He looked at her when she came in, looked at her the way he always looked at her, the full, careful inventory. And he said, "You okay?" "Getting there." "Ethan home this morning?" He nodded. He handed her an apron. She tied it, and she went behind the counter, and she started the afternoon shift. And the rhythm of it settled over her, like something familiar and clean. The machines and the orders and the small, manageable transactions of a cafe. The world reduced to coffee and milk, and the specific human needs of people who came in from the cold. Nikolai did not come in that day or Friday. She registered his absence the way you register when a sound you've gotten used to stops. Saturday, Ethan chose a diner on North Clark Street that he'd been to twice before. A corner place with red vinyl booths and a laminated menu and a counter with spinning stools that he'd always been drawn to. He wore his good sneakers, which she noticed without commenting on. In the car he was quiet, looking out the window, and she let him be quiet. They arrived first. They took a booth. Ethan sat across from her, and he picked up the menu, and he looked at it with an attention that was about something other than breakfast. "You don't have to talk about anything you don't want to," she said. "I know. If you want to leave at any point." "Mom," he looked at her over the menu. "I'm fine. Stop." She stopped. Nikolai came in at 9:03. She saw him before Ethan did. Saw him come through the door in a plain jacket and dark jeans, no coat, no suits behind him. Looking for the first time in 3 weeks like a man trying to be ordinary. He scanned the diner and found their booth, and he walked over and he stopped at the edge of the table. Ethan looked up for a moment. Neither of them said anything. She watched her son look at his father, watched the careful inventory that Ethan performed on everything unfamiliar, the slow, methodical assessment. She watched Nikolai look at Ethan. She'd seen many things on Nikolai Voss's face in the past 3 weeks. She had not seen this. This was something that had no management in it at all. "Hi," Ethan said. "Hi," Nikolai said. A pause. Then Ethan said with complete seriousness, "You can sit down." Nikolai sat. He sat across from Ethan beside Malene, which meant he was close enough that she was aware of him in the way she'd been aware of him for 3 weeks. That constant low-frequency awareness that she'd stopped pretending wasn't there. She picked up her coffee. She let them have the table. They ordered. Ethan got pancakes, which he always got. Nikolai ordered eggs he didn't touch. Malene drank coffee, and she listened to her son ask questions with the methodical patience of someone conducting a necessary interview. The questions were not what she expected. Ethan did not ask why. He did not ask where Nikolai had been or lead with the wound the way an adult might. He asked what did Nikolai do exactly, like his actual job. Because someone at school had said something and he wanted to understand it. He asked whether Nikolai was going to keep coming to the cafe or if that would be weird now. He asked whether Nikolai knew how to build anything, because Ethan's model was done, but there was a new one he'd been thinking about. Nikolai answered all of it directly, simply, without dressing any of it up. He said his actual job now was dismantling things he'd spent years building, which was complicated to explain, but basically meant he was trying to fix a large mistake. He said the cafe question was a fair one, and that he would do whatever Ethan thought made sense. He said he didn't know how to build models, but he was a fast learner. Ethan considered this. What kind of mistake, he asked. Nikolai looked at him. The kind where you make a decision you think is right, and it turns out it was the worst decision you ever made. Ethan looked at his pancakes. He cut a piece. He chewed it. My teacher says those are the ones you learn the most from. He said, your teacher's probably right. She usually is. Malene looked at her son. At this 10-year-old sitting across from a man he'd just met, who happened to have built a criminal empire and was now taking it apart piece by piece, discussing the taxonomy of bad decisions with the same equanimity he brought to water cycle models and baseball statistics. She felt something move through her that was vast and complicated and had no clean name. Something that was pride and grief and relief, all three pressed together. They stayed in the diner for 2 hours. Not because anything dramatic happened in the second hour. It didn't. Ethan finished his pancakes and had a glass of orange juice and told Nikolai about the science fair, which he'd been rescheduled for the following Friday because his teacher had intervened with the administration. He explained the water cycle model in some detail. Nikolai asked 3 questions that were genuinely good questions, and Ethan registered this. She could see him register it. The slight recalibration that happened when someone surprised him with competence. When they left on the sidewalk outside, Ethan stood for a moment and looked at Nikolai. You can come to the science fair if you want. It's Friday at 4. Nikolai looked at her. She gave him nothing. No signal, no permission, no rescue. His call. I'll be there, he said. Ethan nodded once. He went to the car. Malene stood on the sidewalk and she looked at Nikolai and he looked at her and the November cold moved between them. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, she replied. He asked for it. Still, he said. She pulled her coat closer. She looked at the street, the ordinary Saturday morning of it. People walking dogs and carrying coffee cups. A bus moving through the intersection. A woman pushing a stroller with one hand and texting with the other. The whole regular machinery of a city operating without reference to any of what the previous 3 weeks had contained. There's something I need to tell you, she said, about what I said in the restaurant about finishing this. The Marsh situation is not. Marsh, the other thing. She looked at him. Agent Cross called me again yesterday, not to pressure me. He said that if there are people in Nikolai Voss's network who are cooperating with the Bureau's investigation, the Bureau has an interest in those people not being indicted. He said the cooperation arrangement covers associates. She paused. He said, your name is already in the file as the primary cooperating individual. Nikolai said nothing. You've been working with the FBI, she said. For how long? A silence. The bus went through the intersection. A dog pulled at its leash. 14 months, he said. Since before you came into the cafe? Yes. So the dismantling, the accounts, the operations, the people arrested, all of it coordinated, she said. Not all of it, not every piece, but the structure of it, the parts that mattered. She stood with this. She'd suspected it from the file, from the coherence of it, from the way the federal agents had arrived at the facility in 22 minutes. She'd suspected it, and she hadn't let herself land on it until now. You came back to Chicago to finish the cooperation agreement, she said. I came back because I heard you were here, he said without hedging. The cooperation was in progress. coming back and completing it, those things overlapped. But the reason I came back was you. She looked at him. She looked at the man who had made the worst decision of his life at 23 and had spent a decade on the other side of it, and had come back and found a son he didn't know he had and a woman who had survived him, and was against every reasonable odds still standing on a sidewalk in Chicago talking to him. "Were you ever going to tell me?" she said. "Yes. I was trying to find the right time." "There's never a right time for that. You just tell me." She said it without anger. The anger had burned through days ago. What was left was something more durable. "I'm not a person you manage, Nikolai. I'm not a situation you handle. If this is going to be whatever this is, you talk to me straight every time. No calculated timing." "Okay," he said. "I mean it. I know you do." He looked at her steadily. "Okay," she breathed in the cold air. She looked at Ethan, visible through the car window, looking at his phone with his feet up on the dashboard, entirely at ease. She looked at Nikolai. "The science fair is at 4 on Friday," she said. "Don't be late." She got in the car. She drove home. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. That was the thing about real life. It didn't transform. It accumulated. It built up in layers day over day, the way sediment builds slowly and without drama, until one morning you looked at the shape of things and realized the landscape had changed without your ever having seen it change. Nikolai came to the science fair. He arrived at 3:58 and he stood in the back of the gymnasium the way he'd stood 3 weeks before. Except this time Ethan saw him and waved him over. And he crossed the room to his son's table and he looked at the water cycle model and asked questions. And Malene stood slightly to the side and she watched the two of them. She let herself feel for one moment the full weight of what it was. Then a parent she knew started talking to her about the school district's budget, and she came back to the surface and answered all the right questions. And the science fair moved around her the way ordinary life moves, loud and slightly chaotic and entirely indifferent to the extraordinary things happening inside it. Ethan won second place. He was philosophical about the first place ribbon going to a volcano model, which he maintained was conceptually less interesting, but admitted was more visually dramatic. Nikolai agreed with Ethan's assessment. Ethan appreciated this. In December, Gerald Marsh completed his cooperation agreement with the FBI. He was charged with 3 counts of financial conspiracy, reduced from the original 7, and accepted a plea arrangement that would result in federal monitoring and a financial settlement. The remaining members of the network he'd been running dispersed or were picked up on related charges over the following 3 weeks. Nikolai's cooperation agreement moved into its final phase. Agent Cross called Malene one last time in the second week of December and told her she was cleared from the investigation and would not be contacted again. She thanked him. She hung up. She didn't tell Nikolai about the call for 2 days. Then she told him directly over coffee at the Café after close, because that was the rule she'd established, and she applied it to herself as well as to him. He nodded. He sat with it. He turned his cup on the table in that small, purposeless way. Then he said the organization is done. The last structures get transferred to federal receivership in January. After that, there's nothing left. And then what? She asked. I don't know yet. She looked at him. That's an honest answer. I'm trying to give you those, he said. I know. She looked at her own cup. Ethan asked me if you were going to be around for Christmas. Nikolai went still. I told him I'd ask, she said. So I'm asking. He looked at her across the table. Across the 12 tables, and the rain on the window and the coffee machine, and 3 years of her life in this room. And he said yes, if that's what you want. Don't say yes because I asked. Say yes because you want to. I want to, he said. No hesitation. I want to very much. She nodded. She picked up her cup. Ethan wants to try a recipe for something called a Dutch baby pancake. He saw it online, and he's very committed to the idea. I don't know what that is, Nikolai said. Neither do I. That's apparently irrelevant. She almost smiled. Christmas morning, 8 o'clock. Don't bring anything except yourself. Okay. She went back behind the counter. He sat with his coffee for another few minutes, and then he left. And she heard the bell above the door ring twice, the way it always did. Once for the opening, once for the close. Christmas morning was cold and clear, the first real sun they'd had in 2 weeks. and the apartment smelled like coffee and the pine of a tree that Ethan had selected with enormous deliberation and decorated with a focus that bordered on architectural. He was up at 6:30. Too old to have the entirely young version of Christmas morning excitement, but not old enough not to have it at all. A compromised version, the dignified excitement of someone who has decided they're being reasonable, but whose eyes gave them away. Nikolai arrived at 7:58. She heard the knock, and she went to the door. And there he was in the ordinary light of a Thursday morning with nothing in his hands, just himself, the way she'd asked. "Come in," she said. He came in. Ethan came out of the kitchen, where he'd been staging ingredients for the Dutch baby, which neither of them had successfully made before. "Did you look up the recipe?" Ethan asked. "I did," Nikolai said. "Did you find the part where the oven needs to be really hot? 450 degrees. That's the important part. Mom kept skipping that part." "I read the recipe once," Malene said. "You skimmed it," Ethan corrected. "They made the Dutch baby. It took 40 minutes and one failed first attempt and a significant amount of flour on the counter. And one moment where the smoke alarm went off briefly because the butter had gotten too hot." And Ethan narrated all of it with technical precision, and Nikolai followed instructions without complaint. And Malene drank her coffee and watched the two of them stand at the stove together, and she let herself have it. Not carefully, not in small doses, but fully. The way you let yourself have something when you finally stop being afraid it'll be taken away. The second Dutch baby came out correctly. They ate it at the kitchen table with syrup and powdered sugar, and the winter sun coming through the window. And Ethan talked about a new model he'd been researching. A tall ship, historically accurate, the kind with rigging. And Nikolai listened and asked the right questions. And at one point, their heads were both bent over Ethan's phone, looking at a photograph of the model. And she looked at the shape of them, the dark heads together. And something in her chest that had been tight for a very long time loosened one more degree. After breakfast, when Ethan went to his room to start on the tall ship's initial research, Malene and Nikolai sat at the kitchen table with their coffee, the mess of the Dutch baby behind them and the winter sun moving across the floor. "How is it?" she asked. Meaning everything, meaning the agreement and what came after, and the space where an empire used to be. "Quiet," he said. "It's very quiet." "Is that hard?" He thought about this honestly, the way he'd been trying to think about things. "Sometimes. I spent a long time being the kind of person who needed noise to know he was alive." He turned the cup. "I'm learning how to be something else. What are you learning to be?" He looked at her. He looked at the kitchen. The ordinary damaged, beautiful kitchen with the flour on the counter and the smoke alarm still slightly ajar from when Ethan had fanned it, and the tall ship research visible on the table where Ethan had left his phone. He looked at all of it. "I don't have a word for it yet," he said. "That's okay," she said. "You've got time." They sat there in the winter light, the two of them. And the apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of Ethan in his room, the opening of a drawer, the particular sound of model parts being sorted and counted. And outside the windows, Chicago was making its ordinary noises, buses and wind, and the city's vast and indifferent machinery, and none of it required anything from them right now. There was no ring yet, no ceremony, no formal declaration of what they were or were becoming. Those things would come in their own time, or they wouldn't, and either way, they would be chosen, not performed. Arrived at through the accumulation of ordinary mornings, rather than announced. She had decided that she didn't need the architecture of a promise right now. She needed what was already in the room. What was in the room was this. Her son in the next room counting model parts. A man at her kitchen table who was learning how to be something he didn't have a word for. Coffee that was still hot. Sun on the floor. The particular quiet of a morning that didn't need anything from you except to be in it. In January, Nikolai's cooperation agreement with the FBI concluded. The last financial structures of the Voss organization were transferred to federal receivership. His name appeared in a press statement as an unnamed cooperating individual, which satisfied the Bureau's need for procedural record and nobody else's need for anything. He moved out of the glass tower and into an apartment 12 blocks from Malene's building, which was Ethan's idea, suggested with such straightforward practicality that neither of them had been able to argue against it. Malene went back to law, not corporate, not the kind she'd been studying for at 21, with ambition shaped by a world that had since become entirely theoretical. A small non-profit on the South Side that provided legal representation to families in housing disputes, immigration proceedings, custody cases. She started as a volunteer while she completed her reinstatement requirements and was hired full-time in March. The pay was not the kind that changed the math significantly. She didn't care. She was in a conference room in mid-March reviewing a deposition when her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Dad says he needs help with the rigging on the tall ship. I told him to wait for you. She sat with the word for a moment, just for a moment. Then she texted back, tell him to wait. I'll be home by 6. She put the phone down. She went back to the deposition. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, reluctantly in stages with setbacks. Temperatures dropping back into winter for days at a time before advancing again. The lakes stayed cold through April, but by May the mornings were soft, and the trees on Malene's block had come out in that particular pale green of new leaves. And the whole city had that tentative quality it always had in spring. The quality of something that had survived the cold and was slightly surprised by its own survival. On a Saturday in May, Ethan had a baseball game. Third base, the same as always. He was better at fielding than hitting, and had stopped pretending otherwise, which Malene attributed to Nikolai, who had spent 4 months attending games from the bleachers and telling Ethan the truth when Ethan asked for it. The truth being, you're exceptional on defense, and you need to work on your stance. Ethan respected this. He was working on his stance. She sat in the bleachers with a cup of coffee. Nikolai sat beside her. He'd come directly from somewhere. She could tell by the jacket. And he sat down, and she handed him half her coffee without thinking about it. And he took it without thinking about it. And they sat in the May morning and watched their son play third base. She thought about what she'd said to him in the cafe that first Saturday evening when she'd let him in after close. We don't have anything to talk about. She'd meant it when she said it. She'd been wrong about it, the way she'd been wrong about several things. The way everyone is wrong about the things they say from inside their own necessary defenses. What they'd had to talk about had turned out to be considerable. In the field, Ethan made a catch. A hard line drive that he took off a short hop and turned immediately into a throw to first, clean and precise. The whole motion economical and sure. The small crowd in the bleachers made the bleacher sound. Ethan jogged back to his position and didn't look up, but she saw the small adjustment in his posture, the slight straightening that meant he knew they'd seen it. Nikolai said without taking his eyes off the field, "He's good, he's very good. He gets that from you," she said. She looked at him. Baseball, the precision, the way he does things correctly and doesn't call attention to it. She looked back at the field. She thought about that. "He gets the eyes from you," she said. "I know." A pause. "I look at him sometimes and he stopped." "I know," she said. She did know. She'd been watching it for months. The way Nikolai looked at Ethan, with an expression that was still learning how to be ordinary, still adjusting to the weight of what it contained. She'd watched her son absorb a father the way he absorbed everything. Carefully, thoroughly, without rushing the conclusion. They'd found their own thing, the two of them. She hadn't engineered it or managed it. She'd gotten out of the way, which was the hardest thing she'd done in a year of hard things. And she'd watched it build itself according to its own logic. The model ships, the baseball, the Dutch baby pancakes that had become a Saturday thing. The specific serious conversations that happened between two people who shared a way of processing the world, who turned problems over methodically and arrived at answers with the same quiet certainty. She'd watched Nikolai become something. He hadn't had a word for it in December, and she wasn't sure he had one now. But she'd watched it happen. The slow, deliberate work of a man remaking himself from the inside. Not as performance, not for her, but because the alternative was remaining the thing he'd been. And the thing he'd been had cost everyone too much already. It wasn't finished. None of it was finished in the way that things got finished in the version of this story that she'd told herself for 10 years. The version where the ending was clean and the accounting was settled, and everyone knew exactly what they had. That version had never been real. What was real was the bleachers and the May morning, and her son on the field and the man beside her. And the fact that she'd handed him half her coffee without thinking about it, and he'd taken it the same way. And the accumulated weight of all the ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves, that just arrived and then were part of the record. The game ended. Ethan's team won by 2 runs. He came off the field and dropped his glove in the equipment bag and found them in the bleachers. And he climbed up to where they were sitting with dirt on his knees and his hair damp from the cap. And he sat down between them the way he'd started doing. Not self-consciously, not as a statement, just because it was where there was room. "Good catch," Malene said. "I was in the right position," he said. "That's all." "That's not all," Nikolai said. Ethan considered this. "Okay," he said, "but being in the right position is most of it." He was right. That was the thing about Ethan. He was usually right. You had to get yourself to the right position. And then when the thing came at you hard and low, you had to stay in it. Stay low, take the short hop, clean and turn and throw. The rest was just doing the work. The 3 of them sat in the bleachers while the field emptied around them. The other families collecting gear and calling to each other across the diamond. The May sun moving west. The lake somewhere east of them throwing back the light. Nobody was in a hurry. There was nowhere they needed to be. Malene sat between her son and the man who had broken her heart, and then spent a decade learning why that had been the wrong choice. And then spent a year in her cafe and her kitchen, and her life demonstrating in the only language that meant anything that he understood the difference between what he'd been and what he was trying to become. She thought about the ring. She thought about it the way she'd been thinking about it for a month. Not with urgency, not with anxiety, just as a known thing on the horizon. He told her about it in February, that he'd been looking for it, that he'd found it, that he was waiting for the right moment and was trying this time not to miscalculate the timing. She'd told him she'd let him know when the time was right. She'd told him he'd know. He would know. She was fairly certain of that. He'd learned to read her the way he'd always been able to read her before, back when they'd been young. And the whole future had seemed like a thing you could plan your way into. He'd gotten better at it. Actually, the years had made him better at paying attention to the right things. The field was nearly empty now. Ethan picked up his glove and turned it over in his hands, examining the leather of it with the methodical attention he gave to anything he was going to have to maintain. "There's a game next Saturday," he said. "I'll be there," Malene said. "Me too," Nikolai said. Ethan nodded. He put the glove in the equipment bag. He looked out at the empty diamond, the dirt and the chalk lines and the bases still in position. The whole geometry of the thing still holding, even though the game was done. "Okay," he said, "let's go home." They went home. The story doesn't end with a declaration. It ends with 3 people walking off a baseball field in May. Nobody carrying anything they hadn't chosen to carry. The city around them doing what cities do. And the specific lightness that comes when you finally stop running from the thing you needed and turn around and let it find you. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.